afternoon. Welcome to another edition of the Tiny Lab Talks. Today we'll be talking about research in psychology, opportunities and pitfalls. Tiny Lab Talks are brief informal talks between two specialists, one invited by the University of Aveiro and another from the one invited by the American corner and one from the University of Aveiro itself, on topics such as technologies, innovation, research and culture. The conversations usually take place at the University of Aveiro's American Corner Media Lab with the support of the US Embassy in Portugal. I'll start by giving a warm welcome to both of our guests today. I'm joined here today by Nairne and Marco Vasconcelos, but before moving to the conversation, I'll briefly introduce them. Jim received his undergraduate training at the University of California and then continued his academic journey at Yale University, where he earned his PhD in psychology. Although his original training was in Pavlovian conditioning, so in the area of animal learning, he soon switched to researching human memory, an area in which he is highly recognized nowadays. He started his teaching career at the University of Texas at Arlington and is currently an Emeritus Distinguished Professor at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. The area has gained from his dedication and contributions in many ways. Regarding teaching, he has authored a textbook in introductory psychology and its many later editions, and has been awarded several prizes and recognitions for his excellent teaching, which occurred for over 3 decades. On the scientific domain, he has edited books, authored more than 100 works, taken editorial roles in most of the prominent journals in the area, and led several funded research projects. His contributions have been recognized by the scientific community in other forms as well. Throughout his career, he has defied the field on how we conceptualize memory, from his earlier work on immediate memory to the most recent one on the evolutionary significance of memory. It's a real honor to have you here, Jim.
Thank you.
Marco received his undergraduate and master training at the University of Minho. He earned his PhD in experimental psychology with honors and distinction from Purdue University in 2008. He then joined the Department of Zoology of the University of Oxford as a Marie Curie Fellow, which was followed by a research position at Minho for some time. He is currently an Associate Professor of Basic Psychology at the University of Aveiro and a researcher of the William James Center for Research. During his still short time at the University of Aveiro, he has already taken several and important administrative roles related to both research and teaching. Research-wise, although Marco studied human memory during his master's, he switched to studying learning in non-human animals during his PhD. He continued his focus on decision-making and rationality in non-human animals in the following years. His work is also highly recognized in the field, as denoted by his many publications, citations, editorial roles in many journals of the area, research grants and awards, including a recent Fulbright Fellowship, and so on. And I'm Josefa Pandeirada. I'm a researcher here at the University of Aveiro, and besides many other things, I do research on human memory, and I've had the pleasure to collaborate over many years now with both of the two people here, of our guests today. So the title of our talk relates to opportunities and pitfalls in doing research in psychology, and I would like to start with a question that relates to your career paths and somehow relates to the title of the talk as well. You have made shifts and opposite choices regarding your research topics. At a certain point, Jim shifted from studying non-human learning to human cognition, while Marco followed the reverse trajectory. So what motivated these changes?
First of all, let me just thank the university and the American Corner for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I think that in terms of what you choose to work on, I'm not sure you have that much of a choice, because you sort of do what you're good at. And each area of psychology has a certain level of ambiguity associated with it. And we all work at the level of ambiguity that we're most comfortable. So some people, for instance, would are only comfortable at the neuroscience level. They want to talk about neurons and connections and biochemical things, and all the way up to the more social or clinical areas where they're dealing in more vague kinds of issues. And so there's a whole continuum there of ambiguity. And we work at the level that we're most comfortable with and most naturally good at. So when I was an undergraduate at Cal Berkeley, I took all the standard psychology courses, and actually cognitive psychology was too ambiguous for me. I didn't like the level of discussion. I didn't understand what they were talking about. And the animal learning level seemed to hit me. Biology was too low. Pavlovian conditioning was just about right. So I ended up doing that because I was good at it. I found myself coming home after class, walking home and thinking about ideas that I had heard in class. And that's a really good way to determine what you should do. You should do something you're good at, something that just sort of naturally fits with the way you think. And so that led me into studying Pavlovian conditioning at Yale with two really giants in the field, Robert Rescorla and Alan Wagner, who were dominant major figures in the field. And I was lucky enough to get a fellowship to go work with them. It was wonderful. I still think that's the level at which I think the best, is at that ambiguity level of Pavlovian or animal learning. But doing animal learning, it's too long an answer for you, but doing animal learning is very hard because it requires keeping animals, feeding them on the weekends, all kinds of equipment, and it's very difficult to get funding. So from a practical level, setting up an animal lab is very difficult to do. And I really wasn't interested in animals per se. I was interested in the fundamental kind of underlying issues. And so that led me to work to try to address the same issues at the human level. But I have to admit to you that I've struggled a little bit at times in cognitive psychology dealing with some of the level of analysis that they have. So I've kind of done my own way. So that's my answer.
Okay. So I can tell a story retrospectively why I did that, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be just a story. It's a matter of opportunities, really. And I agree with that. But retrospectively, I would say that basically it's a matter of control. How much do I control the history of the subject I'm studying, right? With humans, they come up to the lab half an hour, and I don't know what they're doing before or what they were planning to do afterwards. It is true that with animals, I do have to come to the lab and feed them and sometimes clean and whatever, and it's very difficult in terms of funding, but it adds experimental control over the development of the animal, and that part I like. So that's the level of analysis that I'm comfortable with and I can control. And basically that's what led me away from humans and brought me to animals, I guess.
But while switching from areas which do have somehow a common in the ground, in the sense that the way you both study comes from an experimental and a very basic experimental and methodological level, brings challenges. As you were saying, we have to come over the weekend to feed the animals and clean the cages and so on. But at the same time, you have to figure out ways of doing experiments.
Well, there are a lot of people that study animals that love to study animals. They're interested in animals themselves. I mean, I was interested in the underlying principles of psychology and memory and learning. I wasn't really caring so much what the vehicle was, whether it was a pigeon or a rat or a human.
Right.
And Marco makes a good point in terms of experimental control. You have a lot more control, but then you don't have as much flexibility in terms of designing a variety, asking a lot of questions with humans you can't do with animals. So it's a trade-off.
Depends on how creative you are, I guess. If I ask them, they won't answer, but if I do the right game, they will play it with me. I understand that part. I agree that with humans, I would say it's easier maintaining the lab, I guess, on a practical level. But, with the animals, and I agree with you, I'm not in love with a particular animal besides my dog. I don't care really about the species in the sense. It is a vehicle to study fundamental issues of decision making or choice or reinforcement learning, whatever it is. But yeah, I agree that there is a balance there. It's becoming harder and harder to do animal research, as you know, either here or in the United States. It's the same thing because funding is getting very
So
very,
the
very
universities used to have the money to house the animals and to hire the staff to clean all the cages and do all the maintenance that you need to do, because there are more rules for running pigeons than there are for running humans. So they're much more tight, strict in terms of the requirements. But the universities don't have money anymore, so they started doing things like charging the PI, the investigator, for maintenance, and it could be, a lot of thousands and thousands of dollars. So it put more pressure on you to get grants and pay for that.
The fact that you have a practical issue doesn't mean that you don't have a fundamental issue to solve, which is the scientific one. So we need to balance those things, I guess.
But I think that brings me to some extent to the next question, which is, even though your subject of interest is different, in one case non-human animals and in the other people, there's the creativity that needs to be in both cases, which somehow also led to something that's common in the work that you both do, which is kind of a fundamental functional analysis of the behavior that is not mainstream in research, particularly in psychology. And bringing that new approach into studying either non-human or humans also brings challenges on how you address the issues, on the impact that you're able to have on the scientific community, on how it accepts it. And you in particular started that on human memory not too long ago, which was quite challenging. Not as recent in the animal area, but can we talk about those challenges?
So, the way that experimental psychology worked, at least in human memory, is if you want to study human memory, how people remember, what's the best way to do it? And, well, you need to bring some experimental control to the study of human memory, and that was accomplished over 100 years ago by Hermann Ebbinghaus. And what Ebbinghaus did was he used himself primarily as the subject, but he forced himself to learn things, prose, random syllables and things, and then he recalled them, and he studied kind of the mathematical relationships between things he did at study and the shapes of the retention functions. And he discovered a number of things. If you want to study human memory, give people things to remember and then ask them to recall them. And you can then analyze how the recall looks. But the problem with that is that you end up with lots of effects. Like he discovered that people forget in a very systematic way that can be described by mathematical functions. And other things, like if you space repetitions of material, it's better than if you mass them together, things like that. So ever since Ebbinghaus, people have just taken these phenomena that he discovered and have been attempting to understand why they work that way. And it's been a sort of a process of not trying to really understand why memory works that way, but just analyzing these phenomena that Ebbinghaus discovered. So for 150 years, we've been studying these effects, like the shape of the forgetting curve or space-distributed practice and things like that. But we really have no idea why our memory system works that way. So if you were going to design a memory system from scratch, why would you make it have a negatively accelerated forgetting function, for instance? Traditional mainstream cognitive psychology doesn't ask that question. They're just interested in figuring out what you need to get a negatively accelerated forgetting curve. So what the functional approach does is it sort of turns that on its head and says, what is memory for? So William James famously said, you can't understand a house by analyzing the bricks and mortar. If you want to understand a house, you need to know what it's for, and it's only in that context that things like bricks and mortar make sense. And the same is true, we believe, for the scientific analysis of learning and memory. That you need to understand what the purpose of it is, and its operating characteristics are going to reflect what that purpose is. And that's the idea of studying the function rather than just trying to analyze the parts. So that's the background to what we've done. And the added twist to it is, if you want to know what memory or reasoning is for, well, who knows what it's for, right? I mean, that's not obvious, unless you consider that all of our learning and memory processes are the product of evolution. And evolution is a process that has a criterion, and that criterion is it increases the chances or the likelihood of reproduction and survival. So the purpose of memory and reasoning and other cognitive processes is ultimately to enhance reproductive fitness. And using that as a criterion, it gives you at least an opening, a window through which you can explore why we might have memory and why it might work the way it does. You want to take that?
Yeah. So in my field, in animal research, there's always been a Darwinian approach out there, which is basically from the biological side, what we call the animal behavior field, not animal learning. The animal behavior field done by zoologists is clearly functional. It's been like that for decades, since the beginning, I guess, since Tinbergen at least. But going back to the discussion about the function, I would say that although I do functional analysis like that, I am a Tinbergen in the sense that you cannot get rid of the rest. So what function does is to add something, is to add another level of explanation. So the forgetting curve is still necessary. We need to know all that stuff that is there. So we need to complement, the mechanism with a function, with development, the four whys that Tinbergen explained well decades ago. So I guess that in the human side of the coin, you have more resistance from the established academia, I guess, the established people accepting this new approach. In the animal field, well, learning theorists, they don't like, most of the time, evolutionary, as you know very well, they don't like the evolutionary approach, but it has been there besides them. You take any textbook, any biology textbook, you'll find it, okay? If you take a psychology textbook, well, probably not. But still have, the constraints of learning, the belongingness and whatever. It started like that, right? And now we all have this new, let's call it new field of animal cognition, which is more, I would say, open to different approaches. Although too liberal in some instances, but open to different approaches, I guess. So in my field, the resistance, I didn't feel the resistance, mainly because when I started doing the functional approach, I actually moved from psychology to a zoology department.
Mm-hmm.
So it was easier.
Yeah.
Okay?
But to some extent, introducing these nuances or new approaches, again, brings opportunities, because as we know, it leads to discovering things that we would not have discovered if we kept thinking the usual way. But also brings a lot of different challenges, as we've been discussing. So when we started trying to publish the work, there was some resistance, and there still is some resistance.
I just gave a talk up in Port Hope a couple of days ago on just this issue, the case against evolutionary cognitive analysis. That was the title of my talk. So there's a lot of resistance. I mean, in psychology, they don't learn evolutionary theory. It's not part of the curriculum, so you don't find it in the books. So cognitive psychology textbooks don't talk about evolution. The papers that you see, the talks, it's not even, a key word for like this conference we were at, the European Society of Cognitive Psychology. You have to pick key terms for what talk you're going to give, and they don't have evolution as a key term. So it's not a part of the way of thinking in the current field. So if you try to make these arguments, and the only reason why I could do it, and I've been able to make these arguments in a lot of papers, often publishing with Josefa, is because I was already established as a memory researcher doing the traditional memory research. And so I had some credibility. If I was a new person just starting off, I don't think I would have been able to get a lot of this stuff published.
Let me provoke you then. Let me provoke you. I think there is another reason.
Okay.
And my view, and I'm going to be very blunt now, is that on average, the level of evolutionary psychology is quite low.
I will agree with that.
So when you come with evolutionary arguments, well prepared experimental psychologists, the first reaction they have is resistance. It could be lack of knowledge, but it's also knowledge of what's out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Let me just push back a little bit, because there are a lot of really good evolutionary psychologists out there. I mean, there's some really good work going on. I think early on in the field, a lot of the work was done all on sexual things, and a lot of questionnaire research was done. It wasn't kind of laboratory and experimental work, but in the last 20 years there's been quite a bit of that work, and I think unfortunately the stereotype has stuck with the field, and it really isn't deserved. I'll say one other thing on that, and it's that a lot of the people that started off doing evolutionary analysis, real evolutionary theory, they weren't traditional lab people. They were philosophers of science, and they were people like Dan Dennett, for instance, and they were even Tooby and Cosmides at Santa Barbara they weren't so much strict lab people as they were theoreticians and making arguments. So I think one of the things we've been able to contribute is to bring good laboratory research into that field. That's what we've tried to do.
Okay.
So,
but to some extent, I think that was also what allowed us to start putting the foot in the field, in the sense that we really started investigating the subject while still using experimental methodology that was typical of the area. So we didn't just did something completely out of the box that would not bring any credibility to what we were presenting.
but it's difficult to understand why psychology per se does not view the world through the lens of evolutionary theory, because psychologists believe completely in the adage that the mind is what the brain does. They certainly believe, cognitive neuroscience is one of the hottest areas of psychology, they certainly believe that memory and reasoning and consciousness are biological phenomena. And so to ignore the basis of all modern biology seems a little funny.
Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe the mind is what the brain does. I believe it is what the body does.
It's what?
What the body does,
Oh,
not
okay.
necessarily the brain.
All right.
So, there's my behaviorist bent there. So you need the body to think, in my view. Or at least the traditional one.
He's not really disagreeing with me.
It's just really
just
the embodiment component of that.
Yeah, that's
Which
called
makes sense,
embodiment.
right?
In my time, it's called
Exactly.
behaviorism.
Yeah.
You're not making the Descartes argument, saying we have a separate mind and spirit.
No.
Just having cleared that up.
But having started your careers at very different times in the history of psychology and science, what would you say are nowadays the opportunities and the challenges for those who are starting or thinking about starting their career in research in psychology?
That's a tough one.
You want to go?
I don't know. we're facing difficult times, even for established
Yeah.
researchers.
Well, he'll say the same about
Yeah.
how many years ago.
Yeah.
I
There's
think-
still difficult
Well, I don't
times.
know, the recent years or last decade or something, it's been, at least that's my view. It's been very tough, very difficult. In the EU for funding, for example, but the US is no different, at least in part. So, I think we go back to the basics. If you want to be a scientist, just find something that it doesn't feel like a job. If you can find that, then you should be able to survive and manage, I guess. Any?
Yeah, there are not a lot of jobs. I mean, there weren't a lot of jobs when I came out either. It's very difficult. But now what the university has done, have gone through to the more of the adjunct sort of model where they hire people on short term. They don't really pay them to be regular faculty member. They bring them in to teach courses. And so there are not as many opportunities for people to come in and start a career. But I have to echo what he said as a kind of most important thing. Is you have to be doing this because you love it, and you're only going to love it if you can do it pretty well, because you're competing against a lot of people that do love it, and you know they spend their weekends thinking about these things, and you know they work hard and they're smart, and if you're just doing it to be a professor, you're not going to be successful. You got to really do it because you love what you do. That's important. But it is I would say. There are more struggles, more restrictions on you now than there used to be. It's tougher to make it, I think, now than it used to be.
If you were starting now,
Would I redo it?
Would you redo it?
I just, for me personally, I love teaching was a big part of it for me. I just loved the classroom and getting up and communicating. It helped me think. I'm one of these people that when I'm talking, it helps me think. And the classroom is always a wonderful part of it for me. I really enjoy being a professor. It's a great job. Really good job. So.
We were talking, I can't remember exactly when, about the difficulties of recent events like COVID and how it also changed a lot how universities work, how research is done, and all of that. That adds another level maybe of challenges. And
it's not just that, it's technical. So when I started off as a professor, how much time do we have? A few minutes?
5 more minutes? 4 minutes.
When I started off as a professor, we didn't have the technology that you have now. So, for instance, we had to have secretaries type our papers for us. And there was a drawer, and you would write out your paper by hand, and you'd put it in a drawer, and then whenever the secretary got to it, they would type up an initial version of it and give it to you. Then you had to make 5 copies of the manuscript and put it in a big envelope and send it. And if you wanted to do research, you had to go to the library. And if there wasn't a book in the library, you had to get interlibrary loan. And all the journals you had to go down and read in the library. But the nice thing about that was that when you walked into work, everybody was there. It was an active environment. People were standing around drinking coffee and talking about the issues of the day and science. And now we have all this great technology where you can do everything online, and all the journals are online, all the books are online. You can communicate through email. We submit our manuscripts over email, or online. We don't mail anything anymore. People don't even get mail anymore. And people don't go into the office, so it's not as much fun as it used to be. You don't have the social ties that you used to have. You go in, people aren't there, and COVID just magnified it so that, now they have another reason not to journey into the lab and journey into the office. And I don't like that environment. It was much more fun in the old days when everybody was there and talking. There was a social cohesion that I think we lack today a lot. So I hope that changes for people like you that are still.
Yeah, what I've noticed is since COVID, most of them will telecommute most of the time.
Yeah.
So they stay at home.
Yeah.
And whenever they have to teach, they may go and stay for the entire day in the office and teach their class. But last couple of universities I've been, really people,
And online
That is
teaching,
terrible.
ooh,
it's terrible.
horrible.
So we should just get rid
Yeah,
of the
tell students
computers,
it's horrible.
no more technologies,
No.
back to the...
Well, here's my view. When you're a college student and you're paying thousands and thousands of euros or dollars to go, what are you really paying for? It's not the knowledge, because the knowledge is available to you. Online, you can find videos, you can find textbooks, you can find all these explanations, but what you don't find is a living, breathing person interacting with you. And that's what you're paying for when you go to college. You're paying to be able to interact with us, to come up and talk to us, to go to our office, to work in our lab. That's what you're paying. That's the real resource of the university, not the knowledge. Because you can get that anywhere. And so if nobody's ever there and you're interacting with them online, you're losing what the spirit of the university is. So that's unfortunate, but maybe it'll go back.
Yeah, but related to that, I think you also need to change the mindset of students a little bit, because I think I'm not quite sure that students have yet realized how important it is to come and to interact with people rather than just being in front of a monitor and looking at videos and so on. So to some extent, I think that also requires a change in the mentality of students in trying to pass along the information of how much they can gain with it, rather than just not coming and staying late in bed and so on. I think that's kind of a mutual thing that needs to happen, not on the side of the
Yeah, and
teachers.
professors are writing their lectures on ChatGPT now, not just the students.
Or their papers.
Okay,
So-
Yeah.
That's a completely different talk, I would
Yeah.
say, that with another set of both opportunities and pitfalls. I think we are pretty much done with our time today. So
Well,
again,
thank you
I
again.
would
Thank
really
you.
like to
The
thank
opportunity
you
to
both
be here.
for being here and for this interesting discussion. I greatly enjoyed the conversation and hope our audience appreciated it too. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.